Hello, I'm Salcos, the Dungeon Master of the Prestige Encounters campaign, and this is the first video in a series that will be giving tips and tricks to Dungeon Masters and players alike to make the game more enjoyable for all. Before we get into the video, I would like to let you know about a Discord ran by Prestige Gaming Community. Here you can discuss all the things that make you nerdy, like video games or anime, share pictures of your favorite foods to make everybody jealous, or pictures of your pets. You can even join in our community game night, movie night, and other events that we hold throughout the month. Before I was somebody who was playing Dungeons & Dragons, I was somebody who was admiring the game from afar and wanting to play it. I went out and I bought the starter set and the essentials kit. And I remember getting home and opening them up and going through and finding the player handbook for that kit and opening up and like reading the first 3 pages, and I immediately shut it, put the box into my closet, and it wasn't looked at for another 2 years until I went to C2E2 in Chicago in 2020 and sat down with a dungeon master who helped me make my first character. The funny thing is that I actually never played that character, because my first time sitting down and playing a Dungeons & Dragons session was as a dungeon master for the Prestige Encounters campaign. We had a lot of time on our hands during the pandemic, and we decided that we were going to make the most of it by playing D&D and streaming it. It was a mess. Honestly, the first session, a lot of us had no idea what we were doing. We had a vague idea of how the game worked, but we worked through with the other experienced players that were at our table. And I am forever thankful for them as well. Now, before you go out and start searching for players to join you at your table as a dungeon master, you need to have an idea of how you want your world to be, and the experience that it's going to be as well. Are you going to go out and do a purely theater of the mind and role-playing game, or are you going to do a dungeon crawl with everything mapped out and planned ahead? The first tip I would have for any dungeon master wanting to start a new campaign is to have a play style in mind. Before you go out and you find a player to join you in your campaign and at your table, they need to have a vague idea of what to expect when they're sitting at your table. Is this going to be something where they're just role-playing and have a theater of the mind experience with these great social interactions between NPCs and other players? Or is this going to be a dungeon crawl where there's a massive map and the players navigate through this labyrinth full of monsters and treasure? Having this idea of what your players can expect will give them a better idea of whether or not they want to join your table in the first place, and save you a lot of trouble by keeping them from leaving later on in the campaign. You don't want that to happen, and things do happen. Players do join and leave during a campaign due to real life things or other things that just get in the way, and that's okay. But you can avoid some of this by giving your players an idea of what they can expect when they join your table before they even join it. The next thing you would want to look at as a dungeon master is whether or not you will be using source book material or be doing a homebrew campaign. This is also something that players look for. Source books can be a great resource for you as a dungeon master, as it basically has everything ready to go in a book. That does come with disadvantages. For example, your players may already be familiar with that adventure book and know how it's going to play out and make some metagaming choices based on their knowledge of that book. It also means less planning on your part as a dungeon master. A major part of being a DM is having to plan ahead of a campaign starting. That way, when your players are there, you're not spending time drawing a last minute battle map. And let me tell you, no matter how much you plan, at some point or another, you will be drawing a map last second, just based on the choices that your players made. They're completely unpredictable sometimes. The other option to source books is running a homebrewed campaign. Personally, homebrew campaigns are my favorite, and it's what I run for Prestige Encounters. It does come with a lot of work as well. You have to make this map and create NPCs and storylines that are not pre-planned for you. When creating the lore and background and history of this campaign, you can use pre-made lore like Forgotten Realms, or create a new pantheon yourself if you so choose. That really is the freedom of choice in a homebrew campaign, and it's honestly great. Just be prepared for the amount of planning ahead of time that it would take as a dungeon master. So at this point, you know what your play style is going to be. You have your players interested in your campaign. Congratulations, you're still not ready to start. Before you start, you'll want to study up on the sourcebook material that you are using for your campaign. If you're using a sourcebook, you need to read through it fully as a dungeon master before you start the campaign. Know what the end goal is going to be or the potential outcomes of this sourcebook. If you're using a homebrewed campaign, you need to know what type of monsters and cultures you want in your world before you start to build it. When I built my first world, I wanted giants to be in my campaign. I didn't read about giants. I had no place for a giant or the giant clans to live in the world that I built. So I had this trouble later on in the campaign where to fit them and where to put these amazing detailed lore creatures that are in the sourcebook materials. And that was a mistake that I made my first time DMing, and you will make mistakes too, and that's okay. As you are world building as a dungeon master, a lot of people wonder if they should be from the top down and create the overall world to begin with, or build from the ground up and start with a small town or village where the players will meet and then build out from there. A lot of this can be done progressively as you work through the campaign. You're not going to have everything planned out from the beginning. It's just not possible. Your players should have a freedom of choice in the campaign, and often the adventure will go where your players choose. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that they are free from consequence. If there is a dragon destroying a city and they choose to ignore it, that might have consequences later on in the campaign. The important thing is that as you're world building, you're considering and leaving enough room open for the freedom of choice of your players. And as you're continuing to world build either from the top down view or from the ground up, keep in mind that there are a lot of outside resources that could be useful to you. Websites and the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide is fantastic, but it also can be very vague at times. The reason for this is because it's really your choice as to what your world looks like and what these enemies that your players will be facing will be like. It has great advice on how to do this properly and to not make this a very repetitive and dull experience. Keep in mind that really a lot of this is left open-ended on purpose or intentionally to give you the freedom as a dungeon master to make this a unique experience every time you have players at your table. Outside the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are a ton of websites and online tools that you could be using to get ideas or inspiration from your fellow dungeon masters or other players of the Dungeons and Dragons community. A lot of players will be able to tell you things that their dungeon master did or have done in the past. Some of these stories are quite frightening to hear about what these players have experienced by a dungeon master, and you can honestly learn from that. Learn from other people's mistakes or take things away from people that you think that they've done fantastically. It's great to do, and it's what you should be doing because that's what this community is all about: cooperation. Also keep in mind as you are world building the potential storylines that a player could experience while they are in that story. You will want to keep this vague though when you're planning, because it is very possible that your players might not come to that town or village until they are level 15. And in that case, a horde of goblins is a lot less threatening to them. So you've chosen your playstyle, you have your players, you studied up on the sourcebook material. I know what you're thinking, Salcos, am I ready yet? Probably not. Your players have backstories with their characters, and those backstories need to have a place to call home in the world that you've made or in the sourcebook that you're using. You need to make sure that you have this open conversation with your players prior to the campaign starting for that campaign session 0, and talk to them about what they want their character backstory to be. Will they be someone with a tragic one and their parents are dead? 9 times out of 10 that's the case, and really it's your job to kind of steer them in the right direction while also making sure that their wants and desires as a player are needed, and in the end it's a backstory that they are happy with as a player. Something that gets brought up to me a lot is people think that Dungeons and Dragons is an expensive game to play, and it doesn't have to be. You don't have to go out and buy a $100 dice tray that's made from hand-carved wood. You can use a cereal carton with some felt at your local craft store to protect your table if you really want to. You don't have to go out and buy these expensive gemstone dice or metal dice sets. There are plenty of inexpensive dice sets or even applications that are free for your phones that you could be using to roll dice. And often those things can be preferred is to do it virtually due to how quick it can be to automatically do the math for you and add up these numbers. If you are going to spend money, I encourage you as a player to go spend it at your local game stores. These game stores have provided a safe place for people to enjoy their tabletop role-playing games or board games in general for decades. If it wasn't for them, these games probably would not have lasted as long as they have, and really they need our support now more than ever because they deserve that in the least from us as players. Well, that is all for this video. The main thing to take away here is that this game is really what you want it to be as a dungeon master with cooperation of your players. It takes both groups of people to make this a game. A lot of the topics that we covered today were pretty vague, and we will be covering more of that content in future videos. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.